something that maybe you think belongs in a public school classroom or just in a creative writing classroom at college or university. However, story writing has its place in the English language classroom. It's a very powerful tool to use to get your students to productively use the language that they've learned. Story writing allows your students to personalize what they're going through in their lives or in their family's lives. And finally, story writing allows your students to be creative with the language that they're learning. In this seminar, I'll start by taking you through some of the reasons to use story writing in your classroom. Then we'll look at the components of a basic story. And finally, I'll walk you through different story writing activities to use with your students. The first question we want to ask and answer is, why should we give our students the opportunity to write their own stories in a language classroom? The first one is probably the most powerful one. Writing a story allows your students to personalize the language they're learning. And the more they can personalize it, the more memorable and meaningful that language becomes for them. Secondly, story writing allows your students to work on writing. Writing is the productive skill that most students enjoy the least. It's kind of hard to get our students to want to pick up a pen or sit down at the computer and write. So story writing is a fun way to get your students practicing their spelling, their grammar, and their written formatting. Thirdly, and perhaps most simply, story writing is creative. It allows your students to tap into their imaginations and basically take things wherever they want them to go. Because story writing is personalized and creative, it is also very motivating and very interesting for your students to do. So it's a way to get them to actually want to write. Finally, story writing allows you to get a bit of a window into your students' souls, as very dramatic as that may sound. When students are story writing, they tend to open up a lot more about what's going on in their lives and their families' lives. And you can get a real sense of who they are as individuals. Before we delve into story writing activities that you can use in your language classroom, we first have to review the components of a basic story. And you're going to focus your students on different components with different story writing activities. I'm going to put you to work. On your handout on page number 2, activity 2, I've given you a matching activity. I've given you the components of a story on one side and then the definitions of those components on the other side. So give it a try and then we'll see how you do. Number 1, characters. The correct answer here is letter F. The characters are the people in the story. As the author or the writer, your students are going to talk about what do the characters look like, what do they do, what do they say, and what do they think. 2, setting. The correct answer here is letter E. The setting is all about where and when the story takes place. So the writer will talk about the location, maybe the weather, the time of day, and the time period. Is the story happening in the past, the present, or the future? 3, theme. The correct answer here is letter A. The theme is all about the meaning of the story. So this might be, what are the ideas that the writer wants the reader to pick up? What are the values? What are the ethics? Or what's some key message that the writer is trying to put into this story? 4, plot. The correct answer here is letter C. The plot is all about the series of events that the characters go through as the story unfolds. We can further subdivide the plot into 4 parts. The first part is the problem that the characters have to solve as the story unfolds. The second part is a set or series of roadblocks that the characters encounter as they're trying to solve this problem. The third part is the high point of this problem solving, or the climax, when things get really tense and we're not quite sure whether the characters are going to succeed or not. And the final part is the solution. This is when the characters get to the end point of their problem solving process. 5, conflict. The correct answer here is letter B. The conflict is usually the first part of the plot. It's a problem that the characters in the story somehow have to solve. There are different kinds of conflicts that a writer can introduce in his or her story. There can be a conflict between the characters and nature, the characters and society, between or among different characters, or actually within a single character. 6. Viewpoint. The correct answer here is letter D. The viewpoint is the perspective from which the story is told. There are two main perspectives that a writer can choose. The first one is the first person, so the story is told using I. The second one is the omniscient viewpoint. This is almost like a god. This is the all-knowing and all-seeing perspective in the story, so we can find out what every character thinks and what every character does. For the rest of this session, I'm going to take you through some fun and effective story writing activities to use with your students. These activities are divided into different categories, so I'll first introduce each category and then describe some activities that go into that category. The first category is called story planning activities. Exactly as the name sounds, these are activities that you take students through before they actually write their story, so they can kind of get straight in their head what it is they're going to write about. The first story planning activity is brainstorming. On your blackboard or whiteboard, make 3 columns. Make a character column, a settings column, and a conflicts column. As a class, brainstorm items for each of these 3 columns. So have 10 characters that the class brainstormed, have 10 settings, and 10 conflicts. Students then work individually to select a few characters, 1 setting, and 1 conflict for their story. And then they write their story. The next activity in the story planning category is called random selection. There's a little bit of preparation that you have to do as the teacher here. Make sure you have 1 slip of paper for each student in your class. On each slip of paper, write at least 2 characters, 1 conflict, and 1 setting. Put all the slips of paper in a box or a hat and have students pick a piece of paper. They then have to write a story based on the characters, conflict, and setting that you've written on that piece of paper. A third story planning activity is called drawing. Make a worksheet with 3 boxes on it, one above the other, and label each box. 1 box is characters, 1 box is setting, and 1 box is conflict. Give 1 worksheet to each student. Students then work individually to draw a picture in each of those boxes to represent the characters, the setting, and the conflict. They will then use those pictures as the basis for the story that they write. The next category of story writing activity is called picture-based activities, and these are exactly what they sound like. They're activities based on either photographs or drawings or any type of visual material that will help generate ideas for your students. The first activity in this category is called picture series. For each small group of students in your class, prepare a set of 4 or 5 pictures or photographs. And these pictures or photographs should be completely unrelated. Students work in their small groups to look at the pictures and discuss what's in the pictures and what might be happening. Students then work individually to write a story of their own based on the pictures and on their small group discussion. The next activity in this category is called character picture. Once again, have your students work in small groups and give each group 1 picture. And that picture should be of a person or a character. Students work in their groups to discuss this character. What does the character look like? What do you think the character would think about? What do you think the character would do? Who's in the character's family? All kinds of things about this person in the picture. Students then work individually to write a story that involves this character, and they use the ideas that they've generated in their group discussion. activity in this category is called picture sequence. In this one, you're going to have a series of pictures that are related, and you'll have only one series of pictures for the whole class. Put the pictures at the front of the room so that everyone can see them. And students work individually to decide what order these pictures go in. They then write an individual story based on the picture order or sequence that they've decided upon. To have some fun with this, you can get students to share their stories with their partners or with the whole class so they can see the different things that students individually have done with these different pictures. The final activity in this category is called family picture. Students bring in a photograph of either one family member or a couple of family members. They work individually to write a story about those family members, and the story can be true or not. Then you should give students the opportunity to share their stories either with a partner or with the whole class. This is a really powerful story writing activity because it does allow for so much personalization of the language. The next category of activity is called beginnings and endings, and this is exactly what it sounds like. You provide either the beginning of the story or the ending of the story, and students do the rest of the work. The first activity in this category is called story beginnings. You provide your class with the same beginning of a story, and each student works individually to write the ending. With lower level classes, you'll just give them a single sentence. With higher level classes, you can give them a whole paragraph and then just expect a slightly longer story from them. So for example, with a lower level class, you could give them this sentence. It was a dark and stormy night when the young couple pulled up in the driveway of the haunted house. Make your story beginnings very dramatic, and then your students can have a lot of fun making the endings. The next activity is called story endings. With this activity, give your students the end of the story and they have to write the beginning. With lower level classes, just provide a single sentence. With higher level classes, provide an entire paragraph. Here's an example of what you might give a lower level class. He turned and looked at her one last time and then boarded the train. Students then have to create the story that went before that final line. The next activity is called partner story writing. Students get a partner, obviously, and each student individually writes the beginning of a story. They then trade papers with their partner and write an ending that matches their partner's story beginning. The final activity in this category is called class story writing. Give each student in the class one piece of paper. Have them write the beginning sentence of a story, any story that comes to their head. They should then pass their paper to their neighbor and receive another paper in return. They look at the first sentence on their new paper and write the second sentence of that story. And just continue this process, students writing one sentence of the story, passing the paper on, until you decide the activity is over. At the end of this activity, if you have 12 students in your class, you have 12 very different stories. The final category of story writing activities is called other activities. This is just where we put things that we can't find a home for in the other categories. The first activity in this category is called vocabulary story writing. In this activity, you present the students with a set of words that you want them to include in the individual stories that they'll write. The words can be words that students already know and you're just reviewing them, or they can be a brand new set of words and you teach the meanings to the students first. The next activity is called object story writing. You're going to bring to class a set of seemingly unrelated objects. It could be a coat, a hat, a stuffed animal, and an umbrella. You put the objects at the front of the class. Students have to work individually to write a story that includes each of these objects somehow. The next activity is called Change the Viewpoint. Give each student a copy of a story with a very clear and simple viewpoint. Remember, the viewpoint is the perspective from which the story is written, and we usually have either a first-person perspective or an omniscient perspective. So give the story to the students and have them rewrite the story from the other perspective. The next activity is also an activity that involves changing something. It's called Change the Setting. Once again, give each student an individual copy of the same story with a very clear setting to it, and have students work individually to change the setting. So they have to rewrite the story, but in a different setting. For example, you could give students a story that's set in a big city, and they have to rewrite it for a farm setting. Or you can give them a story set in a particular country, and they have to rewrite it for a different country. The final activity in this category is called Proverb story writing. A proverb is a sentence that captures a piece of wisdom about how to live life well. Put your proverb up on the board and have your students work individually to write a story that somehow illustrates this proverb. Here's a quick example. I could put the proverb up on the board that says, "The early bird gets the worm." One of my students might write a story like this. There was a teenager who wanted to go to a concert that was put on by their favorite rock star. The teenager arrived at the stadium very early and was right at the front of the line. The teenager saw the rock star come in, and then the rock star looked right at the teenager and said, "Hey, do you want to come in and see backstage? And you can spend the whole concert backstage with me." And the teenager thought this was the greatest thing, and they had an awesome time at the concert. So, the early bird gets the worm. As you're working with your students on their writing skills, don't forget story writing activities. These activities allow students to personalize their use of the language. The activities are creative and they're really motivating. So have some fun trying these activities with your students.